muted. Never mind. There we go. Sorry about that. Hello, good morning, and welcome to Mountain Standard Time. It's a bit of a rough go here in British Columbia. We're all a little smoked out, so the CO2 in our blood is built up a little bit. But welcome to Mountain Standard Time. I'm your host, Nathan Giede, and of course, we're going to be speaking with Aaron Ekman today. Stuart Parker's not with us. If you've been through a few Thursdays with us, we have, of course, usually Stuart on in the second half. He, unfortunately, is flying off to Vancouver or wherever he's going, and we'll check back in with him next week. But we'll be doing our weekly news roundup as we do every week. My opening statement this morning is pretty simple, and of course, we'll do our endorsement briefly. You know what? I'd say get outside. Get outside and enjoy the lake while you can, because the simple truth is that God's green earth is out there and it's worth experiencing. And we've probably got a federal election coming in a couple of weeks, and that's going to be a useless, tumultuous, awful, boring, just wickedly unconscionable sort of experience where nobody talks about anything important and everybody points fingers at things that don't matter. And I'd say before that happens, and before you and your children are subjected to another banality of Canadian elections, get outside, enjoy the sunshine while you can, and stay safe, have fun. That's what I would say. But we'll bring Aaron on right away, just after we get our endorsement going here. We have, of course, it's the Resistance Coffee Company. I got to get my banner up here. There we go. So Resistance Coffee is based in Weyburn, Saskatchewan. They bring in their beans and they roast them locally. And the thing about Resistance is that they don't let whatever they're doing get in the way of your freedom. So when they find out that there's somebody out there who's trying to extinguish your freedoms or your ability to express yourself or say what you think or believe what you want to believe, they get involved and they help support the cause against that. So if you're looking for a coffee company that isn't supporting woke causes, but instead is just good coffee and is supporting causes that help with freedom, you're looking for Resistance Coffee. So if you use our promo code, the Western Standard, that will give you a 10% discount on your first order. So there it is on the bottom of your screen. Be sure to use it. Alrighty. So, and here we go. Aaron, you are on the stream. What is happening this morning?
Well, I'm like every morning enjoying my warm cup of Resistance coffee, and I can't stop saying how surprised I am that those Saskatchewanians make such a decent coffee.
There it is. So, British Columbia, it's on fire. There's a federal election clearly in the offing. Apparently, there's racist math. We got a lot of places to go today. Where should we start?
Well, it is a pretty hot. It was a hot week, and I remember the last time I was on the show. I think I started by telling folks, take some care to make sure you get through this heat wave, and we had a number of deaths in the province. It sparked some concerns in the ambulance sector, in the emergency health services sector. I know that the Minister of Health, Adrian Dix, had to make an announcement yesterday. The union representing paramedics, QP 873, is calling for the dismissal of the CEO of the ambulance services. So there's a lot of concern around the province, and a lot of this is coming out of just after the fire that decimated, just wiped Lytton off the map, which all towns and municipalities and cities in the interior of British Columbia anyway, I think, are watching very closely. And literally, I think the day after we did that episode last week where we talked about some of this stuff, and you asked me the question, is there going to be Aaron, do you think there's going to be a federal election anytime soon? Well, the day after that, of course, the Prime Minister did his sweep through British Columbia and made a couple of fairly big announcements, one infrastructural and the other on a new social program. And as we've reported on this channel a few times, one of the big promises of the BC NDP government when they first got elected in 2017, and then they re-promised it again when they were re-elected in 2020, was over a $10 a day childcare plan for British Columbians. So sort of a universal childcare system. And so one of the big name announcements that the Prime Minister rolled out with was, of course, this collaboration with the province. So there was a bunch of fanfare coming out of quote-unquote progressive circles in British Columbia over this announcement, but nothing signifies more clearly that there is obviously election looming very quickly. We actually we got a video of the announcement, which we can then pick apart and talk about here in British Columbia. If you don't mind, pull up that third video that we have there of our Prime Minister in front of that podium.
This is huge. As part of the agreement, in the next 5 years, we'll work with the provincial government to achieve an average of $10 a day childcare for all regulated spaces for kids under 6.
Elbow bump. There it is.
Also in the next 5 years, 30,000 new high-quality spaces will be created. By the end of next year, the average childcare fees for BC parents will be cut in half, and there will be more than 12,000 $10 a day spaces available. And I want to add to all of those parents and families watching us across the country right now, wondering when they're going to have the opportunities that the work that British Columbia and the federal government have done together is going to deliver for families in BC. We're working on it.
What a strong way to finish that announcement. That, if you're wondering when we're going to deliver all of these amazing things we're promising today, 10,000 new spaces for childcare, all this funding, and a $10 a day plan, well, we're working on it. And that's, there's no better indication that this is just a raw buy for votes in British Columbia with absolutely no specifics whatsoever other than these aspirational targets. It reminds me a lot of the jobs-based promises you hear from politicians, in the weeks, months ahead of a federal election or a provincial election as well, where it comes from conservatives as much as anybody else in terms of politicians making these claims that there's going to be 1 million new jobs by such and such a date. In this case, they can't even really come up with a date. And when he tries to preempt the obvious question, well, what are you actually doing here, and when is it going to happen? His only answer that he can muster is, well, we're working on it.
We're working on it, but of course they have to work with the premiers on it, and the premiers have to be amenable to it because childcare and education are purviews of the province. So once again, we're going to have a kind of cross-federalism, right? This partnership that happens. I think it was kind of modeled. It all started with healthcare, obviously, at the federal level back in the 60s, but 50, 60 years on, it's kind of like the provinces won't do anything unless the feds show up. The feds won't do anything unless the provinces show up. So all of a sudden, everything becomes a not bipartisan, but it's always two levels of government, always. And sometimes I guess that makes sense for certain aspects, but I never thought childcare would suddenly become a federal issue.
Well, this is the biggest indication to me that we're not going to ever see this, that the NDP, the BC NDP, has never really had any clear plan, aside from it being funded substantially by the federal government, getting federal dollars into the project, to be able to put anything together that is a sort of a made in BC and a funded through by British Columbia's plan, which is worrisome considering that the Liberals never follow through on any of their commitments, especially the ones that are made a few months or weeks away from a writ drop. So this is what's so frustrating. And I think you and I can, sort of debate the merits of this program in any case, and probably many of your viewers would disagree with me that I think that it makes sense to actually pursue from an economics perspective, from an economic standpoint, the health of the economy of the province, to pursue a universal childcare plan, because one of the things that's keeping people out of the workforce, if you're a small business owner, for instance, and your concern is the price of labor, well, one of the things that affects the main indicator of the price of labor is supply and demand. Labor is treated in this kind of economy like a commodity, and so the price of it increases and decreases based on what the supply of it is. Well, if childcare is so expensive that it no longer makes sense financially for one parent to go to work because they could literally, they don't make as much money necessarily with all of the costs associated with having to get to and from work. You got to insure another car, probably, especially if you're in the interior. And depending on what your wage is or your salary, you may not be making enough to justify putting somebody in, one of your or more children in childcare. It may make more economic sense for your family to have somebody at home. Well, that causes the supply of labor to decrease, and so the price of labor goes up. If it's a single parent family, obviously it's very challenging to be able to work And especially if you don't have a lot of professional skills, for instance, and you generally do unskilled labor, lower wage labor, it's almost impossible to raise a child as well. So there are, from my perspective anyway, and people can disagree with me, economic benefits for this program. But when the BC NDP first came in 2017, their campaign plank was basically a 5-year, I think it was a 10-year runway on this $10 plan. Which means, how many terms do they have to win to complete this? So it's just such a, far in the distance pipe dream. And then this latest edition of a promise from the federal government right before an election that they're going to fund it with no details, and the only real tangible in it is we're working on it, trust us. It's just another indication to me that we're never going to see this in British Columbia, irrespective of whether the merits of it are there or not from your perspective or others.
I mean, I've always come down on the side of obviously there was a BC politics panel that was being run by Stuart for a time, which has also been canceled thanks to the Green Party now. Every party on the left is slowly but surely attacking our beloved friend. But what's happened is when we were having that discussion about childcare, there was let's see. There was, of course, an NDP, there was a Green, there was a BC Liberal, and then myself. And we were kind of all talking about different options. They all talked about some kind of, spaces set aside, publicly funded spaces in one way or another, or private nonprofits, all sorts of kind of third way things. And I'm all on the other side of well, I say we just be able to, if you want to stay at home with your child, that should be a living wage. I don't know what's wrong with that. If we wanted to, I think in a way, probably a way that would get more social conservatives on side is if with something like universal basic income, is that if you basically said, well, there is a universal basic income. And I mean, you don't have to say it that way for those of us who are social conservatives, and it's for mothers of children, but of course, obviously in our world, we could say it is for the spouse who stays home and takes care of the child and children. That would probably bridge the gap between the two worlds in a sense, because really the idea that everybody needs a universal basic income is not something that a lot of more fiscally conservative people can kind of swallow. They're like, well, no, there's work and there's a way of making a living, etc. But at the same time, again, a lot of people, regardless of their particular philosophical leanings, would say, no, look, I understand that a parent at home whose full-time focus is the rearing of the children and kind of keeping the household in order and helping with things thereof, that makes sense. And the reason that it doesn't happen anymore is that wages have stagnated. So now two people have to work to support a family. If we reverse that trend, even if wages don't necessarily change, but there's a fundamental basic income that's being accorded to families in order to raise their own children, that would get a lot of people on side. I think both left and right.
Yeah, I think it ceases to be a universal basic income the moment you try to means test it based on one particular attribute, like being a mother, for instance, which is why, I support a universal basic income across the board. And I think a lot of conservatives do as well, for some of the reasons that you've mentioned, in that it enables a family or a couple, for instance, who are thinking of having children to make a determination easier on whether or not they want to use that as to replace income that they're foregoing because they're deciding to stay at home to look after a child. And if they decide that they want to work in any case because a basic income isn't enough for them, which, basic income's not meant to really be enough to keep everybody in the lifestyle that they want to live in necessarily. It's just meant to be able to cover the bare necessities. They could spend that money, they could choose to spend that money on childcare, for instance, and the requirement for direct state subsidization doesn't necessarily have to be quite as prevalent. That's the criticism that comes from the left against the universal basic income, is that they're terrified that by implementing it, there's justification to start eliminating some other social programs like a universal childcare program if we had one, for instance. And they're not really wrong. I mean, it does provide that ability or that justification to remove some of those things, but it does so in a way that still provides that kind of income to people that they need, but removes all of the additional bureaucratic malaise and cost associated with means testing everything, having to hire all these staff to spend their days determining whether or not you qualify for the benefit. We don't need any of that if it's universal and it goes to anybody. And remember, childcare isn't I don't think it's solely a women's issue. I think there's lots of men that are both in relationships where they're the primary caregiver. There's also single dads. And so, again, it makes it easier and I think more economic to employ a basic income that doesn't require that kinds of means testing, and let people decide how they want to spend the money. And I think it makes sense in that regard.
I definitely think means testing can be a waste of money, but of course the means that I'm looking at there is pretty direct. Obviously, in another time, in Duplessis, Quebec, it'd just be like, well, there's only two genders, and the gender that is the childbearing one is the one that gets the income. So that's a different time. We don't have that time anymore, and so that in our age, I guess, again, we would look at to who is the primary caregiver, not unlike what we do when it comes to the elderly and all the tax credits we have with that. I think to your point that something else might be lost if universal basic income is imposed and all the rest of that. I do think a lot of these things need to be tied up together, but we also look at like the way we build out from places and kind of the meta infrastructure, the way people conceive of things, right? So there's a policy that's ever announced, but policies are announced or logistical items are built, right? Like, big infrastructure is done and people build out from that. So in America, you have this thing, it's called the interstate, the most brilliant idea ever conceived when it comes to traffic. You don't have stop signs on it. You don't have lights on it. It cruises along and you have on-ramps and off-ramps, and that's how traffic remains steady. That doesn't mean it's working everywhere. They need to improve it in a lot of places. It's falling apart. It hasn't been properly maintained, but the concept is sound. In Canada, of course, because if your road butts into provincial and federal highways, you get a portion of the funding. There is no motivation to take an on-ramp, off-ramp approach to funding. So people build out from the highway to get a piece of the federal or provincial money when it comes to highway taxes and gas taxes and that sort of thing. To the same point, I would say that when it comes to this question of universal basic income, or even when it comes to the question of to say it sort of specifically, funding motherhood, I think in a sense we kind of already do this to a point with the child benefit that we have, right? That was improved by the Liberals. One of the few things that I have to admit I agree with what the Liberals did there, because I feel like Harper's penny pinching on it was a waste of time. And second of all, I mean, let's even look at the way that we changed divorce laws in this country. So it seems like whether or not we want to agree on kind of the nuanced way of saying it or how it might be politically correct to say it, the reality on the ground is it looks like we try to fund motherhood one way or another, either through the actual benefit or through alimony, etc. So there's something happens there. So we already build this way. Why don't we just be more honest about it, back up a step and say, well, if you want to do the universal basic income, if you want to try and figure out childcare in general, it's not that it's just motherhood. It's the spouse whose primary job is the primary job. Is primarily tasked with the caretaking of children. And that's what we're going to fund. And if we fund that, a lot of family questions can get built out from there in a more sustainable way, because you know that this person's fully funded. Now it's up to everybody else to kind of, in their orbit, know how to take care of the rest of the cost of the family.
Yeah, again, I'm going to just remind that the cost associated with having to determine on an individual basis who qualifies and who doesn't, it ends up being exorbitant. And I think could be saved in a universal component of it. But what concerns me so much about the Prime Minister coming to make this announcement is, just as you said, irrespective of what your position is on whether we should have a program like this, if your goal is to try to fund something because you agree with me that it makes sense for the economy, it creates a healthier job environment or employment environment in the province, then you'd be really worried that it's dependent on federal contributions, because they're not going to last forever. And so a program like this has to be funded separate from the feds, I think, because it's just not, I mean, you're right that in order to roll this out from province to province, there absolutely has to be buy-in from the province because of the jurisdictional divides. And presumably, a number of provinces might look at a successful rollout in BC and go, yeah, that actually makes sense. We want to do that too. In which case, BC is now fighting other provinces for this federal funding because there's going to be a limit on how much it can expand. And again, if our program here in BC is dependent on that funding, well, then it's not a sustainable model. So it doesn't matter whether you're in favor of this or not. What they're promising us is just election bluster, and there's no way, in my estimation, that they'll be able to pull it off. And it's also evident in how they market his trip here, right? So I've got there's a couple of pictures here of John and Justin sort of cultivating this cult of bromance that they both share on the day that Justin was in the province. So there's two there. One's John and Justin. There's another one with the two of them at lunch, and these photos were floating around. So we can put one up. I just want to show you the degree to which these guys are really kind of cultivating this bromance between each other. So
hey, look at that. They're having triple O's.
This is the second one. Yeah, they're so great pains going towards making sure the photographers catch them having these tender moments with each other. There's the other one of them doing the elbow bump.
Let's see if I can find that one. Just a second. John, lunch, John, Justin. No, that's the same one again. Hold on. See if I can find it.
Yeah, it's not that big of a deal, but
there we go. This one. Hold on. This is why I'm not the producer. There we go.
Yeah, a bit anticlimactic, but this always surprises me. Everybody's doing these elbow bumps. It's like you're actually closer to each other than you would be if you were shaking hands. But anyway, there's a third one there because every time, this is what I find so funny. Every time the Prime Minister comes in and has these, this great rapport with the Premier, and they cultivate this cult of bromance, as I like to call it, you sort of sense coming out of Burnaby, where Jagmeet Singh has his riding, a little bit of jealousy because, as everybody knows, the federal and the provincial NDP parties are technically linked to each other. So if you're a member of one, you become a member of the other automatically. So on the same day, I think, there was this obligatory post by the Premier of Jagmeet Singh, who, for whatever reason, came over the ferry on the same day that the Prime Minister was there. Or I don't know if it was the same day that they were both in town, or whether they were just saving this picture up so he could post the obligatory "No, I'm not cheating on you" with Justin picture. And every time he meets the Prime Minister, he has to follow up with a picture of him with Jagmeet. It's just funny. I don't know if any other Premier really has to do this. And no elbow bump, Sheldon says. I noticed that as well. And no picture of them enjoying a nice white spot burger either. Now
you're the only one for me, baby. You're the only one I'm talking to. This guy doesn't even matter. He's just a friend. It's not a big deal. I guess it's just.
But I heard you were talking about childcare. No. It's just an election promise. It doesn't mean anything. Yeah. I was thinking of you the
what's
whole
a little
time.
Childcare between friends? It's just nothing. It's nothing.
And then, of course, and childcare wasn't his only announcement. He had to take, Surrey is going to be we've talked on this show about the BC NDP's attempts to what's going to be coming down the pipe in the next few weeks. Their attempts to reduce the number of seats in the legislature from the interior by making our ridings bigger and increasing the number of seats in their stronghold areas like Surrey, and using the population-based argument to make that justification. Whereas I think environmentalists, if anybody, should be opposed to this, because it shouldn't matter so much how many people are in your riding if we have a natural resource-based economy, or if you're a conservationist or concerned about the environment, and we being the ones who live here are stewards of that land, then we should have a requisite amount of votes in the legislature to ensure that that land isn't just sort of run roughshod over, and British Columbians don't benefit from the extraction of the resources out of it. But they're going to make a pure population-based argument. So the Prime Minister, knowing this, of course, and the BC NDP eager to make announcements in Surrey, they went out, and if you just play that first clip again, you get a sense of the reaction after this big SkyTrain funding announcement that the Prime Minister made. And you can see that the citizens of Surrey, or the Lower Mainland, if they were coming from all around, weren't quite buying it. So if you roll that clip.
That's all the time we have today. Thank you, everybody.
Merci tout le monde.
We're just going to elbow bump everybody now.
Yeah. Well, and you can hear the boos in the background, and that was actually the most tame portion of that whole thing. He was being shouted down by the crowd throughout the entire announcement. It was quite embarrassing, and there was no way for them to block the audio of it. So people had showed up to sort of protest. I suspect most of the protesters were of a climate change bent, but they just, if the intent was to try to generate some excitement over this announcement in Surrey over more funding for SkyTrains, it just kind of fell flat, and it was a bit humorous to watch. But nothing is more clear than their behavior here to demonstrate that there's absolutely an election coming up. And like Oprah, they're just sort of throwing cars out to everybody. But until you see it arrive in the mail, it just ain't real.
No, it's true. It's true. It's I think with just to go back to the question of childcare for just a moment here, I think that ultimately for me, my policy is always going to be, or rather my stance on this is around these policies is always going to be that the fundamental building block of society is the family. And so if we want a child care policy that makes sense, it has to acknowledge that as first and foremost. There is no government program that can replace parents. There is no amount of formation and education that can replace a home that's stable. Facilitating that's the best thing we can do. When I think about the economy and I think about any of these benefits, and I've grown more amenable to them over the years. I used to be a pretty hawkish fiscal conservative, but I've become more amenable to them over the years in a kind of populist streak. But nonetheless, my fundamental attachment to the family hasn't changed. So I think that's where it always has to be phrased. I don't believe that we have, 3 mothers and 5 dads. We don't. We have aunts and uncles and that sort of thing. And who gives primary care is always a bit amorphous. I'm not arguing that at all. But nonetheless, the family is the fundamental building block. And without an economy that supports the family and then benefits that primarily build the family, I don't know what hope there is. Yeah,
and I don't disagree with you in terms of what I see as you sort of striving for from your perspective, kind of the best case scenario in terms of the development of a child, et cetera. I don't dispute that kind of nuclear family provides, with one person at home all the time, provides a very stable environment for a child, probably a very positive one. But what I don't think any data shows is that that without a childcare plan, that there's an increase in the number of folks that, like, I don't think there's any data that will show that a universal childcare program would decrease the number of people that also strive for that same kind of supportive environment. In fact, I think without a childcare plan, what you do see is a decline in birth rates, because it just doesn't make economic sense for a good number of people to have children anymore. And I think, when you ask people, when you poll people on who are starting to get into their 30s and 40s and haven't had children, on whether they plan to have them, what they tend to say is it doesn't make economic sense to do it. And you see that in a number of countries where the cost of having a child sort of outweighs whatever perceived benefits there might be, or not putting it that way, the cost of raising a child overshadows the revenue that someone can generate through income to be able to support that child. And so you have people making decisions not to do it. So it's interesting. I mean, I would love to see somebody put together research, if we were able to achieve some kind of a universal childcare plan, whether or not the birth rate increases. And because it leads to so many other discussions about the justification or need for more open immigration policies. If you have a declining birth rate, but and the cost of labor is going too high from the perspective of people that follow this stuff, well, you need a higher supply of labor. And that's precisely what feeds policies, both in the US and Canada, to increase the number of temporary foreign workers or undocumented workers that come into the province if there is a declining birth rate and a decrease in the amount that an individual worker, whether they're in a union or not, generally if they're not in a union, they can bargain a higher rate for their pay because the supply of labor is so low, which again spurs companies, especially farms, et cetera, to try to find and import a source of labor. So these things I think are connected. But again, I'm making economic arguments, and I think, and as as we tend to do, you're making more moralistic arguments, which both I think have validity.
No, I agree. What's next on the docket here, Aaron?
Well, sort of related to this. I mean, I hate to talk about Ontario so much, but as I was watching this announcement from the Prime Minister coming out of Ottawa, I started looking at sort of what's happening back where he came from, and there's a couple of items that are a little bit concerning. One of them is that Ottawa is, and many of you have probably heard about this, they're going to spend about $3.5 million on a new plan and a new campaign to teach, and this is in quotes from a CTV article, non-racialized Canadians about systemic racism. So there's a picture I took of the headline in CTV about this story. It's non-racialized 01 there, that picture. If you put that up, there's about 5 slides. We can sort of put them up in order. So this is the headline: Ottawa plans to teach non-racialized Canadians about systemic racism in a new campaign. So this caught a number of people's attention. And, we try to focus on BC specific stuff here, but this stuff flows across the country from province to province as it gets adopted. So it's important to watch this. And I wouldn't put it past the provincial government at all to come up with a very similar plan provincially. In fact, they sort of already have a campaign like this provincially, and we've talked about it on this show. But the big question I think that stuck out in many people's mind, many people who aren't really acquainted with a lot of the jargon that this industry of diversity facilitators and academics, the words that they use, the lexicon they employ, a lot of people weren't really familiar with this term non-racialized. And I don't know if you've heard of it before, or sort of what your thoughts are on it, but it really generated a lot of discussion.
I mean, as far as I know, non-racialized means you look like the majority population.
Well, it means white.
I don't know.
Really.
Yeah.
I started going through to try to find out how they define this stuff. So if you put up the second picture, first of all, you'll see a couple of quotes from a. Yeah, we're going to get into this. This is interesting. So the second one is a National Post article that was covering the same story, and if we just put that up, there's a couple of quotes in there that we should pull.
Sure. I don't have the National Post story.
It says non-racialized 02. It just comes right after this one.
You got it. Do. Hey, your cat's back.
Yeah, she wants to see this national. No, that's the wrong one. It's the second one.
You got it. Racist math, non-racialized 03.
No, non-racialized 02.
Nope, that's the one that says 02 for me.
Okay. Well, anyway, let's blow that one up and take a look at it. So this actually comes from a report. Yeah, I know. Okay, that's enough. She doesn't like this stuff.
No, she doesn't. She's not woke.
So this comes from a document that was by an organization in Ottawa. Actually, it's a municipal document, but it's funded by the federal government. And I don't know if you can zoom in a little bit there, but it defines a couple of things that sort of get to this definition of racialized and non-racialized. I don't know if you can zoom in a little bit there. But first of all, it distinguishes between individual and systemic racism, right? Which a lot of people, from my perspective, the people that mix this up the most are the folks who advocate it, where they talk about having to fight systemic racism. Usually what they're talking about are cases of individual racism. The beliefs, attitudes, and actions of individuals that support or perpetuate racism. Individual racism can be unconscious, conscious, active, or passive. So this is like what this used to mean anyway. Individual cases of racism would be, instances where somebody commits an act of violence against somebody while they're yelling racial slurs. I think the CBC was reporting yesterday that there were attacks against Muslim folks, I think in Hamilton, right? So these would be cases of where the assailant was actually, yelling at them about their hijabs that they were wearing. And I think there was a family that was killed, actually. It was quite tragic. So those would be cases of individual racism. Systemic racism, of course, is meant to be entire systems, hierarchies, institutions, etc., in which racism is kind of baked into everything, all of the processes, etc. And that's where you hear a lot of folks focusing their attention, and that's why you see people wanting to rip apart institutions, etc. They get into this concept of racial skin privilege, which is quite interesting. I'll just read it out. The invisible advantages that are attached to being a member of the dominant white culture in Canada. So right off the top, this is where I find this stuff to be quite, in their terminology, quite problematic, in that I have no idea what white culture is. I don't know if you do, but it just seems to me to be remarkably racist to make this kind of a generalistic claim about any diverse group of people within which there are huge swaths of diversity and cultural differences, etc. And I've never understood what white culture is. It's a total social construct from my perspective. And it doesn't actually exist. Like, perfect example, if I was to go over to your house for dinner, for instance, we'd probably start that meal with a prayer, because you're practicing Catholic. That never happens in my house. That's a huge cultural difference. So is that part of white culture? There's all sorts of major cultural differences in terms of, I think, how your family would interact with each other and how my family would interact with each other, and the different cultural things within our own ethnicity and history. But to try to put apply this mono white culture over top of it, to me just seems like a total fabrication. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think it's kind of nonsense, because especially for us in Western Canada, I think what's kind of interesting is that I bet you where critical race theory will always, and questions around race generally, will always take better hold in a way, is where there is a bit more of a monoculture around this stuff. If you're up in the northeastern United States, and you're a good Yankee, like, you can feel empathetic about some of this stuff. You know why? Because guess what? Being a Yankee, like a Northeasterner American, like, it is a little bit more monoculturalist. It is certain values. They, of course, fought on the freedom side of the Civil War, right? They were colonized first. They had a different kind of aspect to things. Like, that part of the States has a different flavor to it than south of the Mason-Dixon line and further west. And the same is true of Ontario. Ontario is different than the rest of the West, particularly southwestern Ontario and southern Ontario. But the point that I would make is that as soon as you get out of those belts where there were majority populations, and I'm not saying they're any more racist than anybody else, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying that there is a culture there that is somewhat geographically defined and culturally inherent. But if you get out of there, when you go into the prairies, you're into different, as I think Pat Buchanan called them once, white ethnics. Same thing when you go to Chicago in the United States. Greeks, yes, they're European, but Greeks are very different from Spaniards, and they're different from Frenchmen. And so you have what again are called white ethnics. You have all sorts of Central and Southern European cultures. Same thing into the prairies of Canada. We dumped off Mennonites in there and Hutterites and all sorts of different people off the CPR. There are French-speaking Catholics who have never been to Quebec in that area and can't trace their family lines to Quebec. They trace them back to France or to the Bayou and all sorts of other strange places. Like this is nonsense that there's a single monoculture of whiteness. Even white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are not monoculture. A monolithic culture in how they view the world, let alone even what they practice. There is such a thing as high and low Anglicans. There is such a thing as broad church, Anglicans. There's such a thing as people who are more into the charismatic stream and went into a more work-based theology around service, and people who are more intellectual. The idea that there's a single white culture, even in the English-speaking Protestant side of things, is nonsense, and everybody knows that. And no one would have tried to propose this outside of a time where people are completely ignorant of the fact that, a dumpling and a royal cookin and a pierogi are not the same thing, and the people making them are all very different.
Well, I remember years ago when I was a student in Kelowna at the university there, I used to live in the university dormitories, and every once in a while, like every couple of months or so, and I want to refer back to the second paragraph of that piece as well. Every couple of months or so, there would be like this poster that would get put up around the residence, and it was clearly being put up by actual white supremacists, because it had this picture of this young white girl who was probably like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years old or something like that. And the headline was like, aren't you worried about there being no future for white children kind of thing? And you turned it over, and the rhetoric, it was like there has been a bit of a history, very limited, but there actually there have been white supremacists in the Okanagan for a number of decades. Some of them were involved with health food stores and sold sort of white supremacist books and literature through these health food stores. It was
that's bizarre.
It's such a weird rabbit hole to go down. There was a guy up at the college in Penticton, I think it was, by the name of David Lethbridge, who used to sort of track this stuff. He ended up getting sued by them and all. Big rabbit hole. Anyway, we would actually see some of this literature. The reason I'm bringing this up is when you read the back of these pamphlets, they were the only people I ever saw talk about this white culture, right? Like it was only the far right wacko Nazis who were actually putting up, this white supremacist stuff. It maybe was like 2 or 3 people per town or something like that. And they were the only people that would ever talk about white culture, and they would try to fabricate this white culture because obviously they're trying to build some semblance of culture around which to rally and recruit people to their cause. What alarms me so much is that it's no longer those people that are talking about white culture predominantly. It's these diversity people who are really pushing this idea of a white culture. It's a dangerous idea. It's totally inaccurate. It doesn't exist. And if we can I don't know if you can put that thing back up on there again. But the second paragraph sort of gets into some of this stuff. Well, first of all, back up to the first paragraph. It says, many white people don't recognize the privilege that comes with having lighter skin in our society. Example, they're unaware of race and racism. Now, I agree. There are a lot of people, I think, that probably either choose not to acknowledge or just sort of blind to some privileges in society that they might have because of the color of the skin. I don't deny that. Like, I've got jobs over the years that I didn't think I was necessarily the most qualified person for, but somebody maybe on a construction job site or something, they were just more comfortable hiring me because they didn't think they were going to have any carry out any accommodations for somebody else based on diversity or whatever. But you can acknowledge those privileges, but still reject this idea of white culture, right? And it's their idea that they marry these things and try to put everybody into the same boat. And I know a lot of people will say, oh, there's no such thing as white privilege. I'm not here to sort of debate that. I think you can make that argument, and some folks will even agree with you. My point is these things are not married to each other. And then the second paragraph there, people who are white may face discrimination. This is interesting. There's sort of this attempt to try to acknowledge that there is racism of all forms, no matter whether you're white or otherwise. But they reference this paper that tries to discount it. So people who are white may face discrimination based because of their class, gender, sexual orientation, religion, or age, or because of their nationality, ethnicity, language, etc. And it's interesting to me which groups they list: Armenian, Italian, Jewish, etc. However, this does not erase the racial privilege of white people. And so, I mean, I
want to stop for a second here. Did I miss the memo where God's chosen people, the Jews, are now white? Are Jewish people white? They're not white by definition. By racial definition, they're not white. They're Semites, and Semites are not. They're not Indo-Germanic. If we're going to use the as a refined scientific definition that we could use, there are groups, or like ethnography, or I guess anthropology. The language group that comes to us all the way from the Indus Valley all the way to the Iberian Peninsula, the Indo-Germanic language group that's related to all of Europe, including English and, of course, French, which, of course, is then influenced by the Latin and the Romantic languages. But the point is that if we're looking at a single ethnicity or racial group, whatever, we can document that. The Jewish people are not white.
Well, the perfect example that should stick out in everybody's mind, the leader of the federal Green Party right now, Amy Paul, she's a black Jewish woman. So, I mean, this is what's so problematic in their terminology about this analysis, is that it is racist. It assumes that all Jews are white. And that's, as you say, I mean, it's just not the case. So
By
it's
definition.
yeah. So they're trying to acknowledge here that some white people might face some discrimination based on their income and all these other things, et cetera, whether they have a disability or not, but it doesn't erase their innate white supremacy. So, I mean, I just would love to see one of these folks walk down to the downtown east side in Vancouver, for instance. If you haven't been down there, it's really a pretty raw cross-section of the real poverty that exists in Vancouver in this kind of an economy. And the one thing that strikes me every time I walk down there is, there's a number of Indigenous people down there, but by far, and you can see the community on the street because it's a busy neighborhood. Most people just drive through it, but if you walk around downtown, in the downtown east side, it can be difficult to walk in a straight line down the street because there's there's a whole informal market. People got their blankets out, they're selling stuff, and there's just a community that some of which is homeless, some of which is transient, some of which is in they stay in night beds and care homes, etc., and they don't have a place during the day, so they're just out in the street. It's a busy place, and what always strikes me as I walk down there is how white that community is, right? And these are people in our economy that are living in virtually third world conditions, and I would love to see some of the people who write these things to go down there and tell these folks that that they're just chock full of white privilege. I mean, it's just, when you think about it, it just boggles the mind, and yet this is what what our federal government is spending taxpayer dollars on trying to foist upon the population.
No, it's beyond nonsense. Like, again, the whole question of like listing people of Jewish descent as inherently white with no caveats, like that literally makes no sense. But further to your point, like, this is exactly it. This is what lost Hillary Clinton the election in 2016. Where she was telling, a welder from Tulare and wherever else, like, you have white privilege, and he's like, well, I'm a welder. I just have a trailer and a truck, and I try to support my family, and I weld, or I'm a fabricator, whatever. Like, I'm a part of the white working class. Like, I'm not a privileged person whatsoever. I got to figure out how I'm going to pay for my kids' college. I don't know what you're talking about, man. Like, I'm certainly not privileged. And this is the thing. There's what's gone wrong. It's actually yesterday I had Grant Havers on, and he made the point that this has gone very wrong for the left. The left used to talk about class, and it doesn't talk about class anymore. It's almost like only the right is willing to talk about class. Here they're talking about race again, and they're just waving off class as if it doesn't matter. It's like, well, don't you think that people who are in a marginalized community, people who are at the end of things, people who are impoverished, wouldn't they be in solidarity with other people who are impoverished? Like, if you want to make a better world, you'd need to combine these two groups and what I think the left calls intersectionalism or whatever, and they would then agitate for, I don't know, clean water on reserves, and their neighborhood that is ridden with crime to be improved, and that they could get the slumlords out of there. Like, I don't understand why we would suddenly divide these people. It's like, well, you see, this is a reserve, so these people are Indigenous, so obviously they have a certain kind of harm and victimhood that's attributed to them, and then these people who are over here in this really bad neighborhood, but they're majority white, they don't deserve the same kind of treatment, even though they're in the same plight. They just happen to live in a different kind of neighborhood with a different kind of demographic makeup.
Well, you hit the nail on the head. What this represents on the left is a complete abdication of their historic responsibility to provide a class analysis. I mean, I was quite struck watching your show about a week or two ago. You had Brad Trost on, and I'm remotely familiar with Brad because he ran for leader federally previously. But I watched that whole interview, and what struck me so much was how he had a pretty clear class analysis, the likes of which I would love to see the average leftist be able to display, where he talked a lot about how we could really improve Ottawa by, instead of putting more people from the ruling class, CEOs, corporate executives, lawyers, etc. Not all lawyers are part of the ruling class, but they generally represent the ruling class. If we replace some of those folks with more truck drivers and welders and, like your friend, for instance, people like Brad, you'd see a complete difference in terms of how people in the parliament would approach most pieces of legislation, and you'd see different legislation produced. Well, you don't see that. That's a class analysis. That's basically one of what most of the conservative establishment would regard as the far right. Certainly the left would describe him as the far right. And here he is, the only guy talking about putting working people into positions of power rather than, having more black or women or indigenous CEOs. And this is what's so striking to me, is that most black workers, most indigenous workers, most women who are working, they know fundamentally that putting people who look like them in positions in the oligarchy or within positions of extreme power doesn't change anything for them materially. It just means that their boss has a different shade of skin or different genitals between their legs. I mean, and working people, doesn't matter what their color is, they understand this. It's why you don't see working people advancing this kind of ideology. It's why it's why the federal government has to spend $3.5 million teaching the target demographic, which is what was in that National Post article, of basically white males between the age of 30 and 43 or 45. They have to teach them how systemic racism works and how to check their privilege and all this kind of stuff. They have to teach people to understand this. But the reality of it is, this isn't even about going after white men. It's actually about going after the working class as a whole. But what the ruling class, and this is, you can call me conspiratorial. I don't think anybody is actually sitting around in a room planning this. I think HR departments have just sort of figured this out on behalf of the employers they work for. There's the target, between 30 and 44 years old men living in rural or urban areas. And they actually even identify these three areas, Hamilton, Thunder Bay, and Quebec, which are considered to be racism hotspots. Which is, I'd love to see the data on that.
Is there a lot of synagogues burning over there? Is that what's happening? Because as far as I can tell, there's a lot of churches burning in Canada, but I don't know of a lot of crimes against either mosques or synagogues or gurwars or whatever. That doesn't seem to be a pandemic in this country. I'm not saying it never happens, and I'm not saying it's okay when it does. That's not what I'm saying. But,
no, it's
but
very
I don't
selective.
see the pandemic that they're citing here.
No, you're spot on. It's always very, very selective. I don't know if you're hearing any audio issues. I'm hearing a few, but it is always very, very selective. But what my point here is that it's actually not about, they talk about, they literally put in their statements and in their government documents, targeting, they call it non-racialized because it sounds a little less racist than actually listing, white men, for instance, straight white men. Yeah, exactly. That's actually not who they're after. Here's what's actually playing out globally. Populist politicians like Trump, for instance, who understand fundamentally, because they've got a better read of the working class, especially in the so-called Rust Belt states in the U.S. And I would argue a lot of some emerging conservative politicians in Canada, like Brad Frost, et cetera, people like Ellis Ross out here in BC, understand this as well, that working voters respond to messages about bringing manufacturing back home. They respond to messaging about international trade and trying to even it out between us and China, for instance, to make sure that all of the manufacturing, all of the value-based jobs aren't being shipped over there or they're being brought back. The problem is government doesn't really, without getting rather socialistic and employing a number of trade barriers, which Trump did to his credit from my perspective. The only way you can, the employer class, the folks who actually have the money sitting in their bank accounts to be able to set up factories. You and I can't just tomorrow start up a widget making factory here in Prince George. We don't have the funds to do that. The people who do that, they do it in China because it's cheaper, even though they're North American citizens. So the only way to, in their mind, to be able to sort of respond to these populist calls for bringing manufacturing back to the base is to lower the wage rates here on home soil. That's the only way it works in their mind, because otherwise they're always going to be competing against capitalists who are still running their factories out of places like China, Cambodia, et cetera, in these really low wage environments. So how do you lower the wage rates of working people here at home? Well, first of all, and here's my Marxist analysis coming out again, the way employers have always done this in periods where they've decided they have to push wages down artificially, they always go after the most vulnerable group within the working class. So you go back to over a century ago in British Columbia, they generally would go after Asian workers, for instance. But instead of going after them, they would actually import folks from Asia and employ them instead of North American workers, create all sorts of racism between those groups. And the ultimate outcome was that wage rates were pressed down, because Chinese workers in particular in those days they had no choice but to work for less money. It was the only thing that was available to them. So flash forward to today, who are the easiest to throw mud at? Well, white men are you can put public government documents out that specifically target this one demographic in this age category, and nobody's going to come out and say that's racist. And so if you and that ends up being the majority of the working class, especially in family supporting jobs. That part actually is true. I mean, there are more men working in these kind of jobs in the working class in Canada that can support families and white men than any other group. And that can be pointed out by these diversity activists, for instance, but you can't have it both ways. So you can identify that that's the biggest group in the working class, keeping the economy afloat, supporting families, etc. So that's the group you want to go after. If you can push their wages down by attacking their privilege and that kind of thing, you can push wages down for everybody. And that's precisely how this kind of racist stuff is not being used really just to go after white men. It's being used to go after all workers. They're just, the first time in my lifetime, are able to target white men, because this happens to be the group right now that you can get away with this stuff on. And that's, I think, what's behind it.
No, I think that's a very good analysis. And I think the other side of what's happening here is that, quite frankly, I mean, we've also just lost hope in the idea of there being a more equitable kind of working arrangement. Like it wasn't just the idea of there being a 40-hour work week isn't some kind of lackadaisical left-wing idea. It's an idea that both the left and the right amongst the working class agitated for and managed to achieve. Just the same with workers' protections, the same with making sure that there was a duty of care by employers to not just make profit, but the profit that in making that profit, workers were kept safe. A lot of this has been captured, to borrow from Parker's phraseology, and that capture is disillusioning people, which is why union halls are empty in the private sector. It's why people don't even want to go to work safe or to workers' compensation board. They feel that they're not being listened to. They feel like they're not represented anymore, and people are turning to an alternative form of politics to try and get their voices heard. But I think something else that kind of strikes me is, again, to your point of there only being one, only on the right is this actually being discussed. Again, in another instance of the BC Politics panel that I used to be a part of, that Stuart was hosting, there was a moment where everybody on the left was essentially saying, when it came to kind of China and the manufacturers and that sort of thing, and then the issue of international trade, they were just talking about different forms of neoliberalism. That maybe we could up this tariff just slightly, but not really. And, free trade's free trade, and there's nothing we can do about it. All of them were resigned. And I kind of started arguing that. I was like, well, maybe we should impose tariffs here, and we should better organize our workers here, but we should also organize their workers over there and raise the wage rates in those countries to the point where they're on parity with us. And everybody kind of stopped and looked at me, and Stuart Park's like, "Congratulations, Nathan Giede, you are officially a communist."
Yeah.
And I'm like, I didn't,
because none of the lefties on that panel could have figured that out. That's what's so frustrating, right?
And it's like, and I don't really understand why that makes me a communist. I think that makes me more of a Christian than anything else. But nonetheless, I don't know why you wouldn't want people to be paid properly. I don't know. Like,
it's a reflection of the state of the left right now, that it takes a conservative to say these kind of obvious things. What's so interesting to me about this story in particular, so what I've been quoting here has mainly been from this CTV article. There's a video at the top of that article, which we can put up in a second here, and it just plays right at the top of the article. What struck me by it is that there's no commentary, there's very little editing. It's just sort of a raw cut of Toronto-based activists that are really sort of in this diversity and inclusion in all sectors of society, in all facets of our lives, community. And they just play them uncut and unfiltered, which, as somebody who's been involved in a number of strikes, campaigns, radical demonstrations, et cetera, over the years, I have never, ever, not myself or seen anybody else sort of in the trade union movement, given that level of just straight across the board, we'll broadcast exactly what you're saying without any kind of filter or commentary on it. And what these leftists say in justification of this stuff is quite interesting. So why don't we roll this video and then chat about it?
So what can shift? What can we change? How are we doing that? What are people willing to give up? What are people willing to redistribute? What are people willing to face within themselves? Like, I think a lot of times we focus on what we can change outside of ourselves, but if we are perpetuating as individuals the same behavior that these systems of oppression are, then we're part of the problem as well.
I just want to pause it right there, actually, and put that little piece back up on just this quote. This struck me as the best indication that I've seen of all of this, that what these folks are proposing, as much as you may disagree with it, are not revolutionary at all. Like, there's nothing revolutionary about this whatsoever. The old leftist mantra from the collectivist side of things, my tradition, would laugh at this statement that we're going to affect this kind of change based on changing ourselves individually. I mean, this has just never been the left's approach, sort of the Marxist approach to addressing some of the systemic issues they're talking about. This really is the same kind of ideology that is, undergirds the Green Party, which is the best way to save the environment is for each of us to just individually act better and be better people, and for the whole population on an individual level, but at the same time miraculously come to this determination that we're all just going to start recycling and stop throwing plastic and sandals in the ocean. I mean, it's just magical nonsense. And yet these folks that are considered and described often by people on the right as like these cultural Marxists, for instance, they haven't got a Marxist bone in their body. And really, when you get down to pushing them on what they want to do to change things, they're not talking. They talk a lot about systemic racism, but their solutions have no systemic component to them whatsoever. All they talk about is this individual-based re-education and, basically the old sort of Maoist approach, which is sort of where the cultural Marxist connection comes, I think, from analysts on the right. This idea that we have to individually, be brainwashed and change our approach to see ourselves, especially if you happen to be white, a white worker, to see yourselves as inherently racist and part of this problem. And if you don't see it, if you're so racist, man, that you don't even know how racist you are, you're obviously part of the problem. And that's their fundamental analysis.
I think what's interesting here is, of course, maybe the differing point to make here is that theologically, that is kind of the argument for us on, for those of us who hold religious views, particularly Christian religious views, is that we are all sinners, and we individually must try and turn ourselves back in repentance, right? So that is the kind of theological basis of reality. But at the same time, Christ himself says, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's." No one ever argues that the systems themselves aren't in their own. The way of the world's the way of the world. That's never discounted. So it's kind of interesting that there's a sort of naive, not really, I would even call it kind of a pseudo-theological view of like, well, if we all just are better people, then all the systems will change. It's interesting, though, because that is like a religious tenet from a tradition that's pretty far away from most of the things that they're proposing.
I mean, she did in the previous comment sort of allude to redistribution and this kind of stuff. So these old sort of Marxist tenets of redistributing wealth, etc. But they're not. They just sort of spout that stuff off without really understanding. Like, there's no tangible proposal for who is going to have their wealth redistributed, for instance. These people never talk about the billionaires. They never talk about the oligarchs. They never talk about Richard Branson having enough money to launch himself into space. I wish, perfectly honest, I think the left is wrong on this as well, as opposed as they are to billionaires being launched into space. I think traditionally the left should be arguing that we launch all billionaires into space, but they're just so bloody confused on all of this stuff. And this is another example of how, when you really start to peel back the layers, there is no leftist or Marxist basis to any of this stuff at all. It is actually coming from HR departments who are rolling out policy on behalf of the people who have the most money in society, and they're doing so to try to keep workers divided as possible, and ultimately to reduce the wages of everybody under the guise of eliminating privilege from the largest group of the working class, which happens to be white males within that age demographic. That's what this is all about. And it really is something that can spread like wildfire across the country. And so even though this is the stuff that's playing out in Ontario, we have to watch it very closely because it can come this way as well. It's related to another thing that's happening in Ontario, which is the revelation, I suppose one could say, in the Ministry of Education through their grade 9 math curriculum, that math is also somehow racist and discriminatory, and it's another example, if you read the curriculum, which I can show you, of how these people really believe that this identitarian ideology must infect and infest every aspect of society, and they actually just come out and say it. I mean, I first encountered this in the labor movement, where consistently you get these proposals that equity, diversity, and inclusion have to be integrated in our work in all areas. It is the most cult-like approach, and it's ultimately injecting racism into every component of what we do. So we've got a couple of pictures of this grade 9 math curriculum that is being pushed through Ontario right now. The first one is it's called Racist Math Subjective there. If we can put that up on the screen. It's interesting to see this. I mean, I'm not a mathematician by any stretch, but even I know that math is like the antithesis of subjectivity. If anything, it's meant to be sort of the ground zero base of laws for most of the scientific community. And the one thing that was so beautiful about math, or should be so beautiful about math, is it doesn't matter sort of what your circumstances or your identity are, the numbers don't lie. And so let's just scroll through and read this stuff. An equitable mathematics curriculum recognized that mathematics can be subjective. So right off the top, there's this injection of this belief in the Ontario school system now in math, that math is no longer objective, that the numbers can lie, apparently, depending on the color of your skin. So here's the description. Mathematics is often positioned as an objective and pure discipline, but we know better now. That's what the old that's what the previous generation thought, but we've come so far. However, the content and the context in which it is taught, the mathematicians who are celebrated, and the importance that is placed upon mathematics by society are subjective. So the main grievance here is that the mathematicians who were studying happen to be white. And so the obvious response is that we have to remove any reference to white mathematicians because it's somehow alienating, in their terminology, racialized students. This stuff should be terrifying, because this matters. It's like I read this stuff. I don't want to drive across any bridge in Ontario that's been built after the date in which this was integrated into their system of mathematics. I mean, math is not subjective, and the idea that you're going to stop learning from mathematicians, so we can't study Pythagoras anymore. We can't, it's unbelievable to me and dangerous.
I try to find the words to respond to this. I think I'm going to start with a pun. It just doesn't add up, Aaron. But
let's throw that second screen capture.
Exactly. So you know what? That's it. You lose. that's enough of that.
There's one more that talks about inserting equity into math as well.
Is that a thing you can do?
According to the curriculum on the Ministry of Education website in Ontario, it absolutely is. So I don't know if we can blow that up a little bit. So research indicates that there are groups of students, for example, Indigenous students, Black students, students experiencing homelessness, students living in poverty, students with LGBTQ plus identities, and students with special education needs and disabilities. I mean, like, by the time you get to the end of the list of people, why wouldn't they just say anybody who's not a white male? It would just be shorter. You forget what the context of the sentence is by the time you get to the end of this list, who continue to experience systemic barriers to accessing high-level instruction in and support with learning mathematics. So if we're to believe that systemic racism exists within the education system, and I'm not even willing to say that that's not true. I mean, maybe there are some ways that we can identify systemic racism within the education system. Does that justify removing mathematicians from the curriculum and their ideas and concepts because of the color of their skin, especially when you're trying to train people to build bridges? You can start to see sort of the dangerousness of this, and they're not taught And again, you can't deal with systemic racism by making moves based on acts of individual racism or your perceived individual racism. So you don't address systemic racism in an institution by taking out the memory of an individual and their concepts, right? I mean, that's what's so ridiculous. Yes, I agree with the Albertan. This stuff makes me quite nervous. So systemic barriers such as racism, implicit bias, and other forms of discrimination can result in inequitable academic and life outcomes. Okay. Such as low confidence in one's ability to learn mathematics. I think that's kind of racist, actually. Reduce rates of credit completion and leaving the secondary school system prior to earning a diploma. So there you can see they're making these statements that
so hold on. Because math can be challenging and kind of scary, which I mean, admittedly, anybody who's not talented at math and then has to face some of the concepts that, especially in the more advanced parts of math. Yeah, no, math is scary. It's got some challenging aspects to it and some things that really kind of twist the brain and make it really work hard. That's going to scare people out of being in high school and get them to leave high school.
Well, and that's the thing, is that their conclusion on this is that these people are leaving high school or they're failing at this because of the color of their skin. That's what's so racist about this analysis, is that it assumes at a base level that because you're black or because you're indigenous, you're not as good as at this system that's been set up to teach it. And that is fundamentally a racist analysis from my perspective. What's so interesting to me is when they go through this list of, going back up to the top again, for example, indigenous students, black students, and then this big list, they don't mention Asian students, which is one of the largest, especially in British Columbia, one of the largest groups of students in the province. So, if we're talking about racialized groups and anti-Asian incidents of crime violence and racism, et cetera, are on the increase, which, I'll accept that that's actually true. Why are they not included in your list of people who are subject to systemic racism and barriers? Well, it's because statistically, if you look at grade rates of Asian students, they tend to be higher than any other group in our society. And there's probably all sorts of reasons for that, many of which you would probably attribute to their culture at home and the way their families are set up and their parents' approach to their education. And I wouldn't even disagree with you anecdotally. But what demonstrates best the hypocrisy and the nonsense of this approach is that because they've got this inconvenient group, which is actually in the States being barred from attending some universities because of their race, because they see them as being too high performing, they have to come up with all sorts of sort of mental gymnastics to try to make their philosophy fit around this apparent contradiction. And it's just garbage.
It's just insane. Completely insane.
So this is what's happening in Ontario, and I think we have to watch this stuff, because there is absolutely a coordinated effort to try to integrate this ideology under the guise of diversity, inclusion, and equity. This racist identitarian ideology that subverts everybody and reduces everybody to their base immutable characteristics, to try to integrate that into our work in all aspects of society. And they talk like that openly. So when you see this kind of stuff emerge in Ontario, you can bet that it's going to make its way out here as well.
It is pretty mind-boggling, because it's just, you sit there and you're like, I mean, I thought Orwell was just kidding when he said the 2 + 2 = 5 sort of thing. And it's like, no, we're there. We're there now. It's like, no, math is subjective. It's like, I don't know, tell that to the spaceship hurtling through the air at Mach 5. I don't know. I don't think it's very subjective. I think the spaceship needs a certain kind of vector, and the tiles on it have to withstand a certain kind of temperature. And I mean, if you want that to be subjective, you go right ahead. But I'm not getting on that spaceship. Okay, I got other things to do.
Well, I think that's the reaction from most rational people. But it is this sort of spearhead of this effort to try to impose this ideological change on society, which says that we can all tell our own truth. And I hear this a lot. I hear this a lot amongst leftist folks. I even hear that kind of language amongst leftist folks who are otherwise kind of gender critical about and critical of sort of the racist component of some of this stuff. They still talk about, speaking your own truth and that kind of thing. And so, I mean, there's a real philosophical divide there between where the left is now and where the left has been historically. And I would argue this is a huge departure also from traditional kind of Marxist thinking, which is ultimately Hegelian in its roots. It wasn't really a direct challenge on the state of truth. It was a different emphasis on certain aspects of the same truth. I don't think that sort of traditional Marxists and traditional capitalists or Adam Smithites or laissez-faire capitalists actually see the world in terms of its core fundamentals any differently from one another. Their big difference is who should have control over the wealth and who should be in power. That's the big difference. None of that is being discussed in this kind of analysis. All of that class analysis is removed from it, and there's this advocacy for this individual discussion of your own truth. And so your truth is just as valid as my truth, which is a dangerous thought when you start to apply that to the sciences and engineering. And so that's why this is so terrifying to me.
I guess that I'm having a bit of an epiphany here, a bit of an insight into my own thinking, and that maybe that's why I don't fit in very well with the traditional right. Traditional right, kind of just whatever, the fiscal right, I'll say, fiscal conservatives and very pro-business right, because I don't view the world in those terms whatsoever. I don't think about labor and capital and that sort of thing. I'm very much more on a kind of low altitude concrete reality of like what do people have in their own backyard and what do they kind of deal with every day. I kind of see all wages that are below a living wage as exploitive in general, and that just because we're paying our slaves more today doesn't mean that they're not slaves, and that's not fair, and I don't understand why we would do that to people. Simultaneously, I don't have a lot of time for rhetoric about religion being the opiate of the masses and that sort of thing, because as far as I can tell, some religions at this point are the only ones still saying things like, well, particularly my religion, like for example, a woman's cycle is a beautiful thing and it shouldn't be altered with pharmaceuticals just to please the oligarchs in the economy so she's more productive. I have a problem with that. So like I don't know, like I kind of wander around in the world not really understanding the language that's being spoken by kind of players on the left or the right on these questions, because I've always kind of had a more human emphasis of like, no, like we're human beings. We should probably start reasoning from there. We're not labor, we're not capital, we're not resources for people. We're not even necessarily the underclass or the oligarchs necessarily. I use those terms because they're familiar, but like we're human beings first, and we have to probably reason from there. And it doesn't seem like people do a lot of truck with that anymore. I don't know why.
Yeah, I think and I'm just sort of speculating here, but I think part of the reason why you hear some of this stuff articulated in these terms, counter to how you see the world on both the left and the right, is because interest in the ruling class that would like to reduce the wages of working class folks here at home so we can try to compete on the manufacturing level with China and Cambodia. They work simultaneously through the left and the right, especially in a place like the US where you've got only two real political parties, both of which have equal representation and funding by and large from the richest sectors of society. And many would argue the same basic dynamic exists here in Canada, given that only two parties have ever commanded a majority in the parliament. And so, they've got their ideologues in either camp. And again, the goal is to try to keep working people divided. That's always been the goal. Because if you keep them divided, they don't unionize. They may want higher wages, but without some level of coordination, they don't have the ability to negotiate them at least not beyond sort of the few individuals that might be in the top tier of productivity and skill level, for instance. And of course, employers in big outfits like this, they're never really opposed to paying the on a merit base people who perform the best high level, because those people are always going to be the vast minority. So it's always more expensive to try to pay everybody a bit more. But there are consequences in our economy for that, in that if you reduce the amount of buying power that your consumer base has, you reduce your own ability to sell your own goods to a higher number of folks in your own market. And so that's sort of the capitalistic contradiction that plays out. But on an individual basis, rich people or employers, they don't really worry about that, because they're not responsible. They don't hold responsibility for the economy. They only hold responsibility for their own firm. And the role that they play, and I've played this role myself at the top of some organizations as well, is to not sell the store, not give away the store. You have to try to protect your bottom line, etc. But if those folks are given the most power in society, then you start to see the living conditions of working class folks go down, and all of the other negative aspects of that play out through the economy. And my thesis here, of course, is that it often is that the most sophisticated way to keep workers divided in the current epoch is to use this kind of racist identitarian ideology through unions, through HR departments, to try to reduce the rates of unionization and worker organization. And it's working to great effect. That's why it's being ramped up. And it's why the federal government now, on behalf of many of these corporations, who are just as interested in trying to bring manufacturing back here for populist reasons, but also understand in their mind that the only way to do it is to reduce the domestic wages, are quite happy to fund this stuff publicly with taxpayer dollars to roll it out and educate the unwashed masses, so to speak.
What a strange world.
It is. In many respects, it's not strange, but it's because there's nothing really new happening here. I think what's so terrifying is the level of sophistication that this particular iteration of it employs, and how it really is Orwellian in so many ways, in that it's introduced as anti-racism, and it's the most racist thing we've encountered. It's described as inclusive, and yet it's the most divisive process we've ever encountered. Tactic.
And I think the other side of it is that speaking of sophistication, it's only possible. I remember this being a thesis about the tyrannies of the 20th century and the totalitarian regimes. Is like it required mass communication. It required the radio. It required the film, the cinema. Right? Propaganda was a key element to all of the totalitarian regimes, including the resistance of totalitarianism throughout the world. That was key. Mass media, mass consumption of media was important. And so here we are at the same time again with now with devices in our homes that listen to us. Your phone listens to you if it's not in an RFID bag, right? And you can, and I mean, you mentioned something. I remember the other day that I had to go and get a particularly feminine use only product for my beloved, just because she needed it, and my phone immediately. My phone immediately, a day or two later, began showing me ads. I'd never looked for that online or anything. I just mentioned it out loud. My phone heard me and immediately began to send me ads for alleviating treatments for that particularly female cross to bear. But the thing is that it's just, that's the time we live in. It is completely sophisticated. It's so beyond our control. The algorithms are running the asylum. And I don't really know what the way out of that is, except in a very much, and maybe I'm just too much of an apocalyptic or whatever on that count, but I very much see a bend back to then, kind of the homesteading, the get back into nature. Like even the way I opened the show today, I'm like, you know what, the federal election's coming, turn off your TV and go outside, because nothing important is going to happen on TV for the next 6 weeks. And it's the same thing. Just get outside, get involved with real people, have real conversations. It's one of the things we try to do here on the show, obviously. And we're not going to be slaves to the narrative. Try and shape your own narrative. I don't know if that sounds profound or not. I'm not trying to sound profound. I don't understand why we're letting again, it's that line from Aldous Huxley, right? Man was made, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Like everything's supposed to serve us, not the other way around. And why we've built a world that is so fundamentally inhuman, I don't really understand. It doesn't seem like a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, and of course, I mean, my reaction, of course, to what's happening is probably predictable in that it took, in order to develop these phones and a lot of the technology that's enabling this kind of data collection, it actually took massive injections of public sector funds to be able to incubate these things, which is largely why China is leading the world on this kind of technology with 5G, et cetera, because they're far less inhibited than we are, and certainly our American friends, in injecting mass amounts, sort of in an incubation stage for technology to try to produce this stuff. What gets problematic is the way in which the private sector will use this technology in ways that you're talking about. It's absolutely true. It's not conspiratorial at all, because they admit it outright in their terms of service documents, which I have a certain perverse tendency to read. That Instagram, if you have the Instagram app on your phone, which is owned by Facebook, it's got the microphone on your phone's on all the time. I mean, if you say, if you got an Apple phone and you say, hey, and I won't say the word because it'll start sparking people's phones that are listening to this, she'll respond to you. Well, the reason she responds to you is because the microphone's on all the time to be able to hear you. Microsoft was doing this back with the Xbox 360 when they had their little camera sitting on your living room table. If you said, hey, Xbox, then it would launch. So once that microphone's on in your house all the time, corporations that are interested in getting better ad data from you will exploit that. And they sort of get around it by saying, we're not actually listening to you. There's no human listening to you. There's just an algorithm that is parsing your words, which is easy because it's just a speech to text script. And then it pulls the words out that relate to the advertising tags that they put on your profile, and they start spitting the ads to you. So if you have the Instagram app on your phone or anything related to Facebook, then your phone is actually listening to you all the time, and it will play these ads. And I can't tell you how many people have said the exact same thing to me, describing this situation. I'm not even really that as concerned about that. I mean, that's concerning enough to me that I carry around a Nokia 3310. I don't have a smartphone. But it's not as concerning to me as governments that also then start using this technology and apply that data to the files that they have on you and the decisions that they make based on your ability to access public services. This is what's happening in China right now. This is what's actually concerning about the Huawei technology, the 5G technology. I don't believe all this stuff that like they're going to control our brains with 5G waves and like there's nothing more detrimental to our health physically in 5G technology than there is in 4, 3, or 2G technology. It's all a type of radio wave. It's just on a different frequency. What is concerning about it is that because the bandwidth is so much higher, the ability for them to extract more data from our everyday lives and then feed that seamlessly into a government apparatus, or in the case of China, their social credit score system, is the most terrifying Orwellian development that we've ever conceived of, let alone seen manifest. And that is what is actually, like, the United States made the right decision when they resisted the implementation of Huawei technology in North America. I mean, China would literally have direct access to this kind of data coming directly off our phones. It would go right into the Chinese government. So they could, they can collect that kind of data on politicians. They can collect it on state officials. They can collect it on people that are dealing with classified, sensitive information, et cetera. So we very rightly are worried about it. Here in BC, I mean, like politically, we would have, if the Americans hadn't said anything, I mean, TELUS was already pretty much full way down the road of adopting Huawei technology and still really wants to. And this is a terrifying development. I mean, I keep saying terrifying. I don't want people to lie awake at night. There are ways to get around it, but we, as we move into this new era of vaccine passports and governments who, in our experience, describe themselves as democratic, but are looking across the Pacific at China going, we kind of like the ability that the Chinese Communist Party has to conduct surveillance on its own population, they're not going to be able to resist the urge to go down that same road. That's what we have to be most vigilant about. Absolutely, I think.
I think again too, when it comes to the question of what's going on in China, what doesn't seem to make sense to, or at least not be registering with a lot of people in the rest of the world, certainly with the politicians who are in thrall of China, is why are they making the moves they're making? Like, they're going into the Spratly Islands of South China Sea for a reason. They're rounding up the Uyghurs for a reason. They're using organs for a reason. They're implementing social scores for a reason. Like, they are going to become perfect totalitarians. And one of the ways that we used to resist totalitarianism is that it was imperfect, and it was all largely based in ego. Stalin had an ego, Hitler had an ego, Mussolini had an ego, and there was a way to kind of outflank that on a very human level. Again, when the algorithms are running the system, how do you break the algorithm of tyranny when not even the program developer is around anymore? He's been rounded up by the algorithm.
Yeah, and there's similar stories. We could probably even pull one up. I remember seeing a couple of weeks ago, Amazon is starting to employ this stuff as well, to the point where they're integrating algorithms to, they're designing algorithms to take over HR functions. So there was this one story of this older fella who, I think he was in his 60s or early 70s, but he was a good worker, and he was a delivery guy for Amazon. And he'd been working there for, I think, 7 years or something like that, and been pretty good. Had one off day and gets an automated email from the AI telling him that he's just been dismissed because of poor performance. And I mean, this is now at the point where we're going to use AI to make these very human decisions that have real consequences, potentially life and death consequences. And it's always going to be corporations that are on the front end of this stuff, that are on the bleeding edge of it, and they're always going to use it to try to dehumanize aspects of the working class and the workforce, and to try to remove themselves from having to make those decisions. Because if Jeff Bezos can say, well, I didn't fire anybody, the HR system did, then presumably he can avoid the fault for it and maybe some of the ire. But is that the kind of society we want to live in?
I really hope not,
because it's the one we are living in. We're living this dystopia.
Well, and that's just it. Like, I mean, how much further down this hole do you want to go? That's what's kind of mind-boggling to me, is that it's like there's got to be a way to reverse this. I mean, it's the same argument we get into when we talk about like the mismanagement of our forests in British Columbia. We talk about the mismanagement of the economy. Like, there is an alternative way forward. I mean, W.A.C. Bennett proved that. It's not just even grandiose socializing, nationalizing of various items. It is even, if we have all this energy to start teaching critical race theory, we must have the energy to try and create a national story that inspires people to want to do more for their country. Or even if we're going to be good sovereignists on this channel, like, I mean, there's got to be. It's the old argument of like, if you had enough energy to fight about it, or enough energy to argue with me, right? You're in an argument with your other half, or with your child, and they don't have the upper hand. They are wrong. It's like, well, instead of arguing about it, we could be done already. Right? Like, that's always the thing. You could have pushed all your effort into the wrong direction, or you could have just turned it around and pushed it into the right direction. I'm not saying it would be a net zero. I'm not saying it is easy to do virtue, as easy to do virtue as it is to do vice. But one has to wonder how we've gone so far down the rail, like just off the rails, that we really will put effort into things that we know are bad for us, and won't turn around. And I guess you could use the word repent if you want, but just nonetheless acknowledge that this isn't going to work and we need to do something different.
Yeah, well, philosophically, it comes down to whether you see the state as the ultimate entity that must be protected and advanced at the expense of individuals, or whether you see individuals and their collective manifestations as superior to the state, or at least more important than the interests of the state. China is decidedly on the side of the state, and quite openly. I actually read the Xi Jinping thought books. He's released a couple of books. They're extremely repetitive, mainly just a collection of his speeches to try to get some understanding of sort of what they mean by the Belt and Road Initiative, et cetera. And I mean, he very much is a direct continuation of, as a in some respects, a demarcation from where Deng Xiaoping took things after Mao Zedong. But he really is this embodiment of Mao Zedong thought, in which the state must be elevated above, the continuation of the state, the glory of the state is our prime consideration. And there's some historical merit to this from the perspective of Chinese folks, I think, in that, they talk a lot about, and the president of China, of course, talks a lot about the historical century of shame in which China sees itself to have been subjugated by colonial powers, Western powers, and removed from its position of sort of the patron state, if I can put it that way, of all other Asian countries, which for centuries had paid tribute into China. So they've been removed from that post. And everything that's in Xi Jinping's positioning is to try to reestablish China as having been removed, emerged from the century of shame, to retake its place, not just as the patron state of Asia, but indeed of the world. Now, this stuff, I don't get as alarmed about that as a lot of other people do. A lot of people look at this stuff and they go, see, this is the evidence of the conspiracy. Well, it's not really a conspiracy. It's just sort of the aspirations of a state that happens culturally to put the state ahead of the individual. But we also hear the Americans always talking about doing what's in the best interest of American interests. In fact, their foreign policy, the justification for the bombs they drop on most places, the justification for destabilizing Libya by taking out Muammar Gaddafi, the justification is always that we have to do what's in the interests of Americans. So there's nothing really different about that. What is different is that the average American and most politicians would never elevate the American state and the interests of the state above those of the individual. People like me may argue that they do in practice, and in fact Canada does in practice, but at least in the rhetoric they don't do that. In China, the rhetoric is all about the importance of the state, the glory of the state, etc. And so you see in all of these urban villages in China that are being wiped off the map, and there's these very heroic instances of these people who refuse to sell the only property rights they have in China to the state in order to put these big high rises up for the burgeoning class of rich people. They're getting into these very violent confrontations with the construction crews. And it's why you see all these pictures in China of, they call them these, what do they call them? Nail houses, because there's just this one multi-story building surrounded by rubble because you got this one person that wouldn't leave, right? And we can expropriate things here in Canada as well. And in fact, arguably that's sort of what's happening in the peace. But at the very least, there's this effort to try to, you have to compensate folks, and it is there are more rights afforded to those who are trying to resist that. But that's the main cultural difference. But I would argue, in many respects, the Chinese are just more open and honest about it than we are. It doesn't mean that that's the way to go, however. And I know that advocates of freedom, for instance, will always resist efforts by the state and the bureaucracy of the state to try to elevate the interests of the state over that of the individual citizens.
I think it's important to note historically as well, something I cite a lot to my fellow papists often, is that the state was founded specifically as a way of resisting the religious violence that had overtaken Europe in the post-Reformation period, in the 30 Years' War, which saw perhaps as much as 30% of the population, at least of Germany, decimated. But the thing that has to always be remembered is that the state was erected to be an amoral, secular, non-values based, only answering to itself, not answering to a pope or a bishop or to a higher power, only answering to itself. First in the supremacy of the sovereign, then into the supremacy of its parliaments and its legislatures. That was what it was built for. It was specifically built to resist moral argument and theological argument and well, not supernatural, but that metaphysical arguments around the dignity of man and the rest of it. You always use those principles in its rhetoric, and I mean the founding of the United States is clear. So is the founding of France, the refounding of France after the Revolution. All these things are clear. We use it in rhetoric all the time, but ultimately the state is built to answer only to itself alone and to seek its own preservation at the cost of all else.
Yeah, but you're right, and what's so troubling about the left today is that I think there was an understanding of this back in the time of the Bolsheviks, for instance. I think Lenin actually, for whatever faults might be attributed to him, and the authoritarianism that he ushered in, understood that the state, at least in his rhetoric prior to the revolution, understood that the state should wither away, or at the very least, the state should not be ballooned into this thing that is contrary to what you've described, in that it actually is now imposing moralistic arguments onto people. And that's what we're seeing today, is that the left looks at the state and they want to attribute to the state all sorts of questions that impose on our own individual lives, freedoms, etc. They want to turn this state into this massive leviathan that doesn't just provide a better rate on social programs like childcare or dental or universal health care, but also now tells us that we individually are racist, even though we don't know we're racist because we can't recognize it.
Yesterday's guest said the arbiters of conscience and consciousness, right. The way that we conceive of our very selves.
It's a very good way to put it. And the left is driving this, and the left never used to drive this stuff. I mean, the left definitely used to talk about, we've been accused of being large statists because we do want to add to the service provision that comes from the states in terms of social programs. But what the left has not been able to resist effectively, and in fact has encouraged, is this massive ballooning of this Leviathan apparatus that invades our personal lives and tries to impose cultural norms on people and make these mass. And then if you get a group of people that want to radically change the cultural norms, like say, make all sorts of new declarations on gender, and really challenge the fundamental tenets of biology and molecular biology, the state can now be wielded as the main spear in being able to do that. That's a terrifying development. It's not the first time that it's happened in society, and in fact, this is why I view the Maoist tendency with such distaste. Is that was one of the first examples of this cultural aberration, this imposition of a new culture, of a determined culture on the populace through the state, with terrifying results. And from my perspective, really nothing Marxist about it. But that's why I understand sort of the right-wing critique of what we're seeing in universities and HR departments and through unions, et cetera, in describing this as a form of cultural Marxism. It's really more of a form of cultural Maoism than anything else. And most Marxists are as worried about this as anyone else.
And I think, to your point, I would just qualify that I have no illusions about the state's ability to impose its own values. It just answers to no one else's. And I would argue that the great irony is that and I think Orwell would actually have to admit this as well, because he does in Pieces of 1984. He talks about, in his conception, obviously, the total supremacy of the Roman Catholic Church at the height of the Middle Ages and the kind of theocracy that it operated in. And then, of course, the what came after it with the Inquisition, but I would say the irony is that while it might have taken three times as long before, it took 1,500 years to get to that point. Then the Protestant Reformation changed things. It's only taken 500 years since then to enter a new theocracy. What is climate change but a cosmology about our sin with the world? What are climate taxes, carbon taxes, but indulgences? What was COVID and all the control but a new kind of a demonology, to talk about this virus, ever so mysterious? It'd show up out of nowhere, it would come, it would go. Who knew where it was? Who knew what it could do? And then of course, our high priestesses throughout all of our provincial health authorities, they would declare things safe or things unsafe. They would open the gates and close the gates, right? What you bind in heaven shall be bound on earth. And so this is the world we live in. We live in a secular theocracy now, and I would say this: at least the non-secular theocracy, the formerly sacred theocracy, produced some very beautiful art. and some nice churches, some incredible music we still sing today. I don't really know what secular theocracy is giving us other than terrible sitcoms and diabetes and a huge amount of fear and neurosis.
Yeah, and a new way to live, apparently, and to view ourselves through a radically different gender lens. But this is, this is the conclusion that these folks have drawn, that the state can be transformed and wielded into an instrument to impose these ways of viewing the world. And, you can speculate that they might be successful. It's not impossible for them to be successful, and many would regard. Things are so different just in the last 5 years, in my estimation, especially in the labor relations world, in terms of the omnipresence of this kind of theory. That it's a real testament to how fast this stuff can spread and how dangerous it can become. But they've obviously made this determination that this is the way to impose this stuff. But whether you agree with it or not, it poses some real consequences because it's just not the case, despite the degree to which these sort of upper middle class white liberals who propagate this stuff as much as they do believe that they're speaking on behalf and for the interests of the disenfranchised people of color and disability and differing gender and sexual orientation. They're really only speaking for themselves. And through their efforts and through the transformation of the state, their ultimate goal, whether they're aware of it or not, is to keep all those folks divided. All of the things that you've mentioned in terms of what, as you term it, secular theocracy has produced, what among those things have done anything to increase the amount of what I would describe as solidarity between working class people spanning religion and race and gender and sexuality? Nothing. It's done only the opposite, to keep folks divided. And that there is the best indication of what the real program is. You always look at who's benefiting and what the result is. And the result is not greater solidarity amongst working class people. Quite the opposite.
It's like Lenin said, right? You look at who benefits, and I am the walrus. No, Donnie, no. Vladimir Ulyanov.
So good. Now, it's a bit of a rough transition, but we should probably make some reference to this. It's a bit of a disaster, actually. This crane collapse in
the crane
Kelowna.
collapse. Yeah. Do you have a link for me on that one, or do I?
I don't. I had a whole bunch of. This is the one I had a whole bunch of video links, and none of them played out, but because of a formatting issue. But this I think this happened Monday morning, so it's not the newest news, but quite concerning. I'd be surprised if nobody's heard, if there are people out there that haven't heard of this. But a crane owned by an organization called Mission Group, which does this kind of work in Kelowna, although the actual crane operation was subcontracted to another company, which to my knowledge hasn't been named. The boom section of it just fell and collapsed all over the building. The really unfortunate part about it was that there were people on the boom. There were people on I don't know if it's called the stem, which didn't collapse, was still sort of in a shaky way attached to hanging off the building. And then there were people on the ground upon whom the boom fell. So on the first day, they had announced there had been one casualty as a result of this. It's probably easy to pull up a picture of it. By the second day, they had announced 4 deaths and one person still missing under the rubble. And I think it had been confirmed since then that the 5th person was also found dead, rather predictably. So just a total disaster. It reminds me of, if you're familiar with the Bentall Tower in Vancouver downtown, I think probably back in the 80s when that was being built, there was a similar disaster where I think a platform fell right off the top of the building, and I think there were 4 or 5 people killed there as well. And I mean, that was so significant at the time that every year people from the different trade unions show up to commemorate that site, etc. They do like a ceremony. I don't know if we'll see the same thing in Kelowna, but really kind of troubling that this a disaster this kind of scale can take place on a work site like that. And so I went through and sort of tried to parse some of the statements made, because the CEO did a press conference like that day, and I had some video clips, but like I said, they didn't come through. But he was asked. I was surprised to see him do the press conference actually on the day. Normally they clam up don't say very much. So I guess, we can credit him with doing that. But he was predictably asked some tough questions like, are you going to pay for any of the medical costs that might not be covered, or some support for families that depended on the income of the folks that were killed? And of course, the company, sort of the CEO backed off of making that commitment. What'll happen in this case? Oh, and the other question was, well, is the job unionized? And it was not. So you'll probably hear in some quarters in the labor movement, this predictable response that, well, if they had been union, this wouldn't have happened. Obviously, that's not necessarily true. Although you could probably make the argument that statistically, safety considerations and safety regulations are followed more strictly on unionized environments, because unionized environments tend to have stronger health and safety committees. They tend to sort of follow the rules a bit better because they're written in a contract in addition to other pieces of legislation. But these kind of disasters can happen on a unionized environment. In fact, they have. Like I said, the Benthall Tower was definitely a unionized job site. What's more concerning is that what I really hope doesn't happen is that the families that are probably seeking some redress don't get caught up in this bureaucratic garbage where their employer mission group tries to blame it on the contractor, who is the direct employer, doesn't take any responsibility from it, and then the contractor tries to say, well, it was a mission group site, so we're not responsible either, and these folks are just sort of left in the balance. But it's quite troubling. They had to shut the whole downtown core down, I think, for the better part of 2 or 3 days, and it puts a real chill, not just on the job site, but a bit of a chill on the industry as well. So what will probably happen is WCB will conduct some kind of a investigation, and the company will probably get some kind of a fine, and most of us will probably think the fine isn't significant enough. But the other interesting piece here is, if this had happened in the US, where they don't have like a workers' compensation system like we do, each individual employee or family that's surviving would be able to sue that employer directly, potentially for much more money. And that's one of the criticisms that even comes from the left of the workers' compensation system in British Columbia, is that it's mandatory for the employer to pay premiums into it. The result of it is that the injured or killed or surviving family of killed workers, we forego our right. We have no right to be able to sue the employer directly. So you're kind of limited in terms of redress to whatever WCB decides they're going to give you. And that may or may not come out of whatever fine they assign to the company. And they may not assign a very large fine to the company. So we'll have to watch this and see how it transpires. But it sort of exposes some of the peculiarities about British Columbia in how it plays out.
Yeah, no, it's a sad note to end on, but all we can do is hope for a safer environment in the future, and to pray for those who passed. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us today, of course, and thank you for spending the whole time with us. We'll be back on our regular schedule next week, I believe, but thank you, and we'll bring you up to speed shortly.
Always a pleasure.
All right. And I think that as we kind of head off into the weekend here, that's the end of Mountain Standard Time for this week. Again, I would like to reiterate that if there's going to be a federal election very shortly, we're all going to get overdosed with all sorts of political things that are just totally irrelevant. And there's no need to pile on. So I'm going to end off with no grandiose statement, no, exhortation, except to say that please get outside. Take your kids. Enjoy what we have as a blessing in this country, no matter what region you're in of it. There's a beautiful part to this country. I've been into the north. Even the bleakest parts of the north have beautiful pieces to them. So head outside and enjoy the weather while you can, and try and shake off what's been surrounding us these last few months with the lockdowns, with the restrictions, and now the fires and the cultural divides we're facing. Get out there. If you see another human being, be friendly. And enjoy what we have as our stewardship and our heritage on this planet we call Earth. In any case, thank you so much for tuning in today. We'll be back again, 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain, next Tuesday. This was Mountain Standard Time. Thank you for watching.